Good afternoon. I'm Rebecca Schemke. I'm the Director of Voter Services for the League of Women Voters of Washtenaw and also a member of the Advocacy Committee. Since this is a public presentation, I do want to remind everyone that the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. The League works to increase understanding of major public policy issues such as this: how can we work to fix the problem of human trafficking? The League also works to influence public policy through education and advocacy. In regards to human trafficking, the League opposes all forms of domestic and international human trafficking of adults and children, including both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. The League considers human trafficking to be a form of modern-day slavery and believes that every effort should be made through legislation, changes in public policy to prevent human trafficking. And in that regard, to further our education goal, I'm very pleased that Elizabeth Campbell, a clinical assistant professor at the University of Michigan School of Law and the co-director of the Human Trafficking Clinic at the law school, has agreed to spend an hour with us talking about the problem of human trafficking in Washtenaw County. Just a little bit of background about Elizabeth. Her research and teaching at the clinic focuses on human trafficking, including the issues of immigration, domestic violence, and criminal law. In addition to her teaching duties, she regularly trains attorneys, law enforcement, medical professionals, and social services providers on assessing and identifying victims of human trafficking, as well as on best practices in providing comprehensive legal services and other services to victims. So with that, I'm very excited to turn over the program to Elizabeth Campbell.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm going to share my screens. So as Rebecca said, I am the co-director of the Human Trafficking Clinic at the University of Michigan. I have been with the clinic for 12 years now. It took me a minute. I needed to put that together in various positions, but I've been leading the clinic in a sort of co-director capacity for approximately the last 5 years. So before I launch into human trafficking, just to give you a perspective on what the clinic is and how I have the expertise that I have, this is some information about what the clinic does. So for those of you who don't know, law clinics are classes at law schools where students are enrolled and they represent real clients under the supervision of licensed attorneys such as myself. So it's the most hands-on practical experience students can get in the course of law school. And the University of Michigan has like 17 different legal clinics. There's an innocence clinic, a child advocacy clinic, a pediatric advocacy clinic, a general litigation clinic, and then there's transactional clinics as well. So the Human Trafficking Clinic is just one of those programs. And we represent victims of human trafficking across the entire state who have been victimized or are at risk of being victimized. And it's regardless of their type of victimization, which you'll understand in a few moments, their gender, age, or nationality. And we do our best to provide comprehensive legal services. So the best way that I can describe this to people is we are a poverty law practice for a particular population. You know, it's not that we only practice one area. We're really trying to meet the civil legal needs of the clients that we interact with. The most common needs are immigration-based and post-adjudication criminal relief. So when people have criminal records, we will assist with that, as well as victim witness advocacy and prosecutions. And I'll talk a little bit more about all of that in a moment. So that's sort of what we do. All right. So what is human trafficking? We're going to spend a significant portion of today talking about what it is and what it is not, because one of the greatest challenges in this field is a whole set of myths and misinformation that surround what human trafficking is. And so I always take the opportunity to correct a lot of those misconceptions. So in its simplest form, human trafficking is compelled service. If someone said to me, what's your soundbite? That's it. It's compelled service. It is not just compelled commercial sex. It's also not physically forced of anything. It is a broader category that encompasses all kinds of different compulsion and encompasses all kinds of different services. And again, we'll be talking more about that. So under the law, there are two definitions that's sort of bifurcated. There is a definition for sex trafficking and a definition for labor trafficking. In a moment, you'll sort of see why there are those different sort of categories. So the three elements of labor trafficking. I have to show all three of these to identify a person as a victim of labor trafficking. I have to show that they were recruited or harbored or moved, transported, or obtained, okay? So that's what we call a process, by the use of force or fraud or coercion, and then for the purposes of involuntary servitude, debt bondage, or slavery, okay? Quickly to unpack each of those a little bit. That first one, right, that's actually usually a pretty easy element to prove, right? If I can show that someone purchased a plane ticket, that's moving them. If I can show that a person responded to an ad for a particular job in Mexico, that's a form of recruitment, right? So there's lots of different ways to prove that first one. And then I move to the second one. And I have to show that, though, in the course of whatever the service was that they were completing, there was some sort of force or fraud or coercion. Doesn't have to be all three, it only needs to be one of those three. And I'll unpack more about that, because that's that prong, as we call it in the law, to prove is usually the most complex and important piece that we're unpacking. And then finally, I have to show that this force or fraud or coercion that was being utilized by this trafficker is for the purposes of involuntary servitude, which is sort of what it sounds like, right? A person who's put into a condition of servitude as a result of compulsion. Debt bondage, I'll have an example of that later, but essentially where a person is put into a condition of debt, and as a result of that debt, they're compelled to engage in different services or slavery, okay? So that's what labor trafficking means. Sex trafficking is slightly different. Sorry, there we go. So there's three elements of sex trafficking. So that will start to look the same. There are more ways to prove a process, right? So recruiting or harboring or moving or obtaining or patronizing or soliciting, lots of different ways to show that process. By the use of force, fraud, or coercion, that is the same. But the only end for sex trafficking is commercial sex. And commercial sex is defined broadly. It's anything of value traded by any persons in exchange for sex. So anything of value, it doesn't have to be money. It can be goods, services, etc. by any person. So it's not that the victim themselves has to walk away with that value. In this case, a third party, a trafficker, could gain that value for any sex act, right? So that definition looks very similar to labor trafficking, but there's an important distinction. If you're talking about a minor engaged in commercial sex, and this is under federal law, you do not have to show that there was any force, fraud, or coercion. Essentially, by virtue of being a minor engaged in a commercial sex act, you are a victim of human trafficking. We are essentially saying we don't think minors have the capacity to legally consent to commercial sex, right? That's sort of a policy decision that's been made. So that's a distinction from labor trafficking, right? Under the definition for labor trafficking, there's no different treatment for minors versus adults. But when we're talking about commercial sex, if you're talking about a minor, you don't have to show compulsion. If you're talking about an adult, you do still have to show that force or fraud or coercion, okay? To be clear, many instances of minors engaged in commercial sex still have force or fraud or coercion, right? That's still a very, very common tool that is utilized. It's just not a requirement to show it under the law, okay? So those are the simplest sort of definitions of human trafficking. I've spared you the legalese, which is significantly more complicated and sort of gruesome to get through. But this is really what those two definitions are. And at the clinic, we represent both victims of labor and sex trafficking. And the state of Michigan has been, has seen cases of both throughout the state. And I'll get to more on that in a moment. So I want to take some time to unpack myths Because again, one of the most significant issues that we have in this field is misinformation about what human trafficking is. So the first one that I want to unpack is the difference between what human trafficking versus human smuggling. Particularly in the media, they tend to get this wrong. They'll sort of conflate these two ideas. So if I go back to those definitions I was just looking at, trafficking is really about exploitation. It doesn't actually require transportation. Transportation is one way that you can prove a process, right? I can show that so-and-so was transported, but it is not a requirement of trafficking. In fact, I have clients who were born, raised, and then trafficked all in Washtenaw County, right? They never sort of traveled anywhere particular. So it's exploitation-based. Human smuggling is transportation-based. What happens though is when we're talking about issues, particularly along the southern border, people will say, there are X number of victims of human trafficking, and they're actually referring to human smuggling or vice versa. So smuggling is when a person crosses an international border without proper status, or when someone assists someone in doing that, right? So if you hire someone to help you cross the border, you have engaged in human smuggling, both the person who was hired and the person who crossed the border, right? That's not necessarily trafficking, right? If that was a consensual agreement between those two parties, it's an illegal agreement, but it was not exploitive in nature. And like I said, you don't have to have transportation to prove trafficking. What we do sometimes see is human smuggling can develop into trafficking. So it's very common for, let's say, you have an individual who hired someone to help them cross the southern border. Say it costs $10,000. And once that person gets to the US, they don't have $10,000 in cash, they have a debt that needs to be repaid. And the person that said, I'll help you cross for 10,000 says, well, in order to pay this back, you have to work at this farm and only this farm. And I'm going to automatically deduct it from your wages. And I'm also going to make you pay for your housing and your transportation, all this kind of stuff. That is a situation where smuggling has become trafficking. And that's a situation of debt bondage, because what happens is that debt's never going to be paid off. That individual who's working at the farm can work month after month after month, and they are really, it's just an illusion. And the debt is used though to keep that person in that state of servitude. Okay. So let's talk about some other myths. What if the victim isn't physically hurt? This was clear from the definition, but I like to say it anyway, because we often imagine that human trafficking must involve physical violence. It does not require physical violence. Certainly physical violence is a relatively common tactic, but the most significant tactic is psychological coercion, and that is sufficient to prove human trafficking. If I can show psychological coercion, I have identified a victim of human trafficking, as long as they meet the other problems. What if the victim can leave? So I'll have people say to me, well, so-and-so wasn't locked up. They could just walk out of the room and, everything would be fine. Well, the question isn't, can they physically leave? But it's two things. First of all, just because there is one moment where a person maybe has a second to leave, doesn't mean that we don't know what was happening before that, and they may have been restrained or kept in a particular place prior to that. It's also a question of what they believe. Do they believe that if they were to leave, something bad would happen to themselves or somebody else? That's that psychological coercion question, right? If you can show that the individual thought, well, if I tried to leave, they would call immigration and have me and my family deported. Or if I tried to leave, they have threatened to hurt my family back home. That's all sufficient. And I don't need to show that my client was actually physically kept in any kind of imprisoned situation, okay? So let's talk about my favorite / least favorite myth, which is data on trafficking. You will consistently hear statistics thrown out about how common human trafficking is. And if you actually pay attention, you can, and you try to match up these numbers, it kind of doesn't make sense. So this is just one example, right? So this is data on the number of people who are victims of human trafficking across the world. Those are vastly different numbers. We have 27 million, 21 million, and 2.4 million. There's no standard statistical deviation that would encompass all of those numbers, right? So what's correct? Which of those three? Open question. And then if you look below, this is another statistical or data point that says, you know, how common is sex trafficking versus labor trafficking? And again, you have wildly different numbers. One says 79 of reported cases are sex trafficking, and then another says for every one case of sex trafficking, you have 9 cases of labor trafficking. So some of this is about differences in definition, right? Modern day slavery, I don't know how that's defined in that first statistic. And I do know that there's this particular definition for forced labor as used by the International Labor Organization, but I don't know how that compares to the modern day slavery number. And if I look down at the bottom number, it says the number of reported cases. But the one below that doesn't say anything about reported, it just says a sort of raw total. But I don't know how they came to that raw total. And we just find that these numbers are thrown out all the time. These just sort of random numbers. We hear them also about locally. I've heard a number of times that Michigan ranked number 2 or something like that for trafficking in the United States. I have no idea where Michigan ranks. I have no idea where, how many victims of human trafficking there are in the state of Michigan or in the United States or in the world. Data in this space is notoriously unreliable. And so we really sort of, at the clinic, we work hard to avoid throwing out stats. And instead we caution everyone to look at statistics with a huge amount of caution and suspicion, okay? And for people who throw out stats, I encourage you to challenge them about where they come from. You can be polite, right? You can be diplomatic in your challenge, but nevertheless to challenge them because again, it's so raw. So here's what we do know. We can have anecdotal data of some kind. So there's the National Human Trafficking Hotline. It's been around since 2007. I only have data from 2015 going forward. But so this is the number of tips, so cases, not victims, but cases that they got information for from 2015 to 2021, which is the most recent year that they have comprehensive data. And you can see it sort of was going up for a chunk of time and it then started to go down. Query how the pandemic impacted those reports, et cetera. But so this is a useful anecdotal sort of point, but it is not something that I could extrapolate to say, I have statistics on national, state, et cetera, averages, right? So this is another anecdotal data. These are all the countries. So for the clinic, we've represented individuals who come from all of these countries, right? Sometimes more than one, sometimes it's just one client from each particular country. But I just like to give people a sense of sort of where our clients come from. And again, it's all over the map. Certainly, we have more clients from Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. They are our geographic neighbors, right? So we just have a larger population of those individuals in our client set, but it's really from all over the map. And most importantly, you'll notice at the very bottom, we do represent US citizens, right? And I'll be talking about that in a few moments as well. So where in Michigan have we identified trafficking? This is a list. I won't read it to you because it's too long, right? But the point is that it encompasses all different kinds of communities. And again, certainly there are some communities where we've had more than one instance of trafficking. And that's because it's a larger population or it's a more vulnerable population or something of that nature. And then of course, if you look at statistics from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, every single state is represented. Trafficking occurs everywhere. There is no community that has been spared. So I want to talk about what trafficking looks like, both in a broad sense, and then we'll go to some specific examples. So the National Human Trafficking Hotline did a study of the types of industries that you most commonly will find trafficking. They identified 25 industries, and they broke them down into sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So these are the industries that were most likely to utilize victims of sex trafficking in the course of business. I'm trying to think if any of these require a sort of further explanation. The sex trafficking ones are relatively straightforward and where one would anticipate, right? They are the sort of sites of commercial sex. Certainly the frequency changes from year to year. What's going on with sort of the internet can constantly change how individuals are being exploited sort of in person versus remotely. And that's sort of an always changing situation. I think more surprising for folks are the industries where we see labor trafficking, which again, are sort of all over the map. There's no particular sort of form of industry that I can say, this is not subject to forced labor. But I will say these are the sort of most common. So again, I'm not going to read them out, but I will tell you that, we have seen in the state of Michigan pretty much all forms of this, except for places where we just don't have that much of that kind of industry in the state anymore. So for instance, I haven't identified a case of forestry or logging. We just don't have as much of that in the state of Michigan anymore. We did once upon a time. And I'm not saying it's impossible that it could still be true, but it's just not something we have seen. Okay, let's go to the next myth. After sort of being sort of reliance on statistics, I would caution you, and instead it's okay to sort of talk about what we know and what we see as anecdotal. The next myth that I want to talk about is the perfect victim who is rescued by the savior law enforcement. So this is a very common image that is put out by the media, by different parts of the anti-trafficking movement, that sort of says like, a perfect victim is a person who hasn't made any mistakes. They were a totally innocent bystander, and one day someone came to them and totally took advantage of them. And then when that person is interacting with an authority, law enforcement, social worker, doctor, whatever, they will immediately report the crime. They'll say, oh my gosh, I am a victim of human trafficking. Please help me. And whatever help is offered to them, they say, oh, thank you so much. And there's this bad guy that I want you to go after. I would have a significantly easier job if that is how most survivors presented. So in reality, human trafficking is a crime that preys on vulnerability of all kinds. And we're going to talk about risk factors in a few minutes. But vulnerabilities that reflect real life people who have made real life choices. Lots of my clients were suffered from some sort of addiction before they met their trafficker. Lots of my clients have mental health issues that cause them to make decisions that you and I might not recommend that they make, that leads them to a trafficking situation, right? Lots of my clients do not trust authority. And so when offered help, do not just say, oh, thank you so much. I'm so happy you're here. Lots of my clients have feelings of, they have ambivalence maybe towards their traffickers, but sometimes even love for their traffickers, depending on the nature of the relationship that led them there. But typically what happens in trafficking, it's not a stranger who traffics people, right? These myths of you go to a parking lot and someone gets punched in the face and dragged into a car, that doesn't happen. it's a relationship of trust that usually is the source of trafficking, and the person with power takes advantage of the trust that they have built with the person who has vulnerability, and the trafficking grows from that. That's where the exploitation comes from. And so it's a complex set of feelings for my clients, okay? And rarely are my clients rescued. Most of my clients, if they have escaped their trafficker, have done so through their own abilities, capacities, resourcefulness, resilience, etc. And law enforcement intervention sometimes results in my clients walking away with better circumstances, but often results in my clients walking away with no better circumstances or worse circumstances. And I'll talk about that in a few moments. So in truth, we are criminalizing victims of human trafficking on a regular basis because we expect them to be perfect. Because our image of them is so wrong, we are in fact utilizing policies that subject them to various kinds of legal harm. So first of all, in the state of Michigan, if you're under the age of 16, you cannot be arrested and charged with prostitution. But if you are 16 or 17 years old, you have a presumption that you're a victim of human trafficking and can't be charged with prostitution. But a prosecutor can overcome that presumption by saying, well, this minor victim did not substantially comply with court-ordered services. So let's say, as I have had, a 17-year-old client who was ordered to a set of services through the Child Protective System because they were identified in a commercial sex scenario, and they are not compliant with those services. I ask you, what 17-year-old is compliant with any prescribed plan by an adult, let alone one who suffered trauma? There is an option for that prosecutor to come forward and say, well, this person is not acting how I think a victim should act. So I think they're in fact a criminal and they can be charged with prostitution. So that's legally allowed in Michigan. We also don't have any form of affirmative defense for victims of human trafficking in the state. Meaning, if my client is charged with some sort of crime that stemmed directly from their victimization, there's no sort of recognized defense in criminal law to protect them, right? Not every state has this, but certainly some states do, and Michigan is not one. And although this is not criminal, technically, I would argue that it's of significant criminal-like consequences. We are often deporting foreign nationals who are victims of human trafficking because they are not complying with law enforcement in the way that we think they should be. Okay, one of the requirements if they want to get a visa is they have to work with law enforcement. And if they don't, they risk deportation. So again, this image of a perfect victim will want to work with law enforcement in every possible capacity. So I talked about vulnerability. These are some of the sort of vulnerabilities that I'm talking about. I'm not going to read them out because I think that they're hopefully should be relatively obvious to people, right? All of the ways that people are vulnerable in our society for a variety of reasons are the same for trafficking, okay? So I want to talk about a couple examples here in Washtenaw County. These are anonymized, right, because of client confidentiality. But so this is a 20-some-year-old woman who is living in extreme poverty in Africa. A woman living in Washtenaw County who's from the same home country offers her an opportunity to come to the United States to work and live. And Fatima takes the opportunity. So the trafficker purchases a ticket for her. She comes to Washtenaw County. She then starts caring for the children all day and all night. She receives no pay. She's sleeping on the bathroom floor. She doesn't know where she is because she doesn't leave the apartment. She doesn't really know where she is. Additionally, the husband regularly sexually assaults my client Fatima. And she's eventually able to escape by sort of working with somebody else in the apartment building. So quickly, this is the way that this sort of sets up into what a case of human trafficking is, right? And just to sort of show you the process that we go through when we're identifying, I just wanted to go through that. So that's one example in Washtenaw County. Here's another one. So again, we have a foreign national client. She is living with her employer here in the United States. And she came though, because she thought she would be a nurse. She was recruited to be a nurse by this employer. And at first she was providing in-home nursing services. But eventually her employer says, you know what, I think it'd be better if you provided me with essentially domestic labor in the home. And she becomes, and she's sort of put into a condition of domestic servitude. Her employer is constantly threatening to call law enforcement on her, and utilizing the legal system like that, making threats to the legal system is considered coercion. And she's not paid any money because she owes the recruiter who works with the employer money, okay? So again, here's the way that I prove out, that she is a victim of human trafficking. She's living in the employer's home. She was recruited by the employer to come. She was made a fraudulent work offer, right? And she suffers from threats of deportation, which is coercion. And there's evidence of both involuntary servitude and debt bondage. And last example. So this is of a US citizen living in Washtenaw County. She was a minor who was raised by her grandmother. Her mother throughout her life was intermittently homeless and her father incarcerated. She was once assaulted by her brother in her home, so there has been CPS involvement in the past, but she's also a frequent runaway. And on a few different occasions in the course of running away, she has been put into situations of commercial sex, okay? You can sort of read the details on the slide here. But it happens more than once. And it's not a situation where it happens multiple times by the same person, right? In the first instance, she was sort of, she was put into this condition of commercial sex by this male friend for one weekend, and then she went back home, right? And she went back to her life. And then on another occasion, she has this other interaction with an adult man in a bar who takes her to a motel room in Detroit. So there are sort of multiple instances of sex trafficking there. And again, remember, because she's a minor, I don't have to show force, fraud, or coercion. She was a minor involved in a commercial sex act. I can show that she was harbored in this apartment on the first occasion and transported on the second, and therefore is a victim of human trafficking, okay? So I'm gonna wrap up with what can you do in your sort of role in the community? And the first thing people wanna know is, how do I identify? And I'm really reluctant to respond to that question because I think it's a really hard thing to ask the average person to do. I honestly don't expect average people to identify trafficking. It is a hidden crime. It is not out in the open. It takes a very discerning eye. But you know, there are things we can sort of look for, and so I would hate to walk away and not give you anything. But what I would say is, just know that anytime I am working to identify a victim of human trafficking, I'm having a rather in-depth, very specific conversation, you know, in order to complete that assessment. So if you're some general indicators for trafficking, I think some of the most significant ones are, if a person is constantly accompanied or by another person, and that other person does not let the one person talk, that's concerning, right? If you go to a doctor's office, any kind of sort of like government office, any place to sort of request services, and one person is just not allowed to speak for themselves, that is a cause for concern for me, okay? Similarly, evidence of dominating or controlling relationships. Indications that this person doesn't have a great sense of time or place, right? Their own address, the current date. Someone who is not in possession of their identity documents, particularly a foreign national, if they don't have access to their passport and somebody's holding their passport for them, that is very, 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 like, that's a huge red flag for me. Someone who's not in control of his or own money or is not being paid properly is, again, strong signs of human trafficking. Okay, some specifics to labor trafficking. Someone who's been abused at work or threatened by their employer, right? I'll have people say to me, well, my employer slapped me once, and they don't think anything of it. And I'm like, okay, well, that's not normal. That's not legal. Let's unpack why that happened, and I can learn more. Someone who's not allowed to take adequate breaks for food, water, et cetera, is exposed to hazardous material without the proper equipment, is required to live in housing, an employer-provided housing, has a debt, and cannot freely come and go from work. Sex trafficking indicators are much harder. because again, it's an illegal industry, so it's meant to be kept hidden. So, but honestly, obviously, if you interact with someone who's under the age of 18 and they say that they've engaged in commercial sex, that's a victim of human trafficking. Someone who uses language that's common in the commercial sex industry, and people who have their sort of permanent regular residence in a hotel or motel. Again, that's not all people in that situation, but it is a common trait. So what can I do for folks who are victims of human trafficking clinic? There is a specific immigration visa that I can seek for them, and that is the most common thing that we do. It's a complex process that requires specialization in this field. There is the opportunity to file civil suits, right? And there is a form of, you can get rid of prostitution convictions if you can show that you're a victim of human trafficking here in the state of Michigan. But largely, a lot of this is Band-Aid work. Very little of it actually changes circumstances for people, I would say, besides the visa. So I'm going to close with, what are the kinds of, if you care deeply about ending trafficking and protecting survivors of trafficking, these are the policies that I encourage people to support. So increased resources to combating unfair labor practices at local, state, and federal levels. The state and federal, the departments of labor, the equal employment offices are pretty low funding on the scale of things. And so encouraging them to get more funding with your folks is really positive. The Washtenaw County Prosecutors Unit started a very unique sub-program with this most recent prosecutor. And so it's called the Economic Justice Unit. And that's a really great example of a creative way to start to identify more unfair labor practices. Comprehensive immigration reform. Our current immigration system puts people at risk of exploitation because they are in hiding and fear immigration authorities. I would say complete criminal immunity for those under 18 engaged in commercial sex here in Michigan. So getting rid of that sort of subcategory for 16 and 17-year-olds. Affirmative defenses for victims of human trafficking. Vacating criminal convictions. That's different than expunging. A vacatur means it fully comes off their record. They never should have been found guilty in the first place. And that's something we would encourage to happen in Michigan. Expanded consumer protections for victims. We are seeing more and more people having just absolutely horrific consequences to their credit as a result of human trafficking, and there's nothing we can do, just nothing. And more effective crime victims compensation fund at the state level. And then finally, positions to support. So reject unfounded data. We talked a lot about why that's important. Hold public officials accountable to combating labor trafficking. We pay enormous amounts of attention to sex trafficking and almost no attention to labor trafficking as a society, zero. And that has dire consequences to victims. Judicial training requirements in general, so that judges are trained on trafficking, would be incredibly helpful. But I would really encourage people to look beyond the criminal legal system as the solution, and instead to look to empowerment-based solutions. So we have a ton, the anti-trafficking movement could learn a ton from the violence against women movement. So combating domestic violence and sexual assault, which occur with human trafficking all the time, but following that sort of empowerment, trauma-informed based model that has been developed by DV and SA agencies. Again, looking to economic justice models, and then finally, just making sure that any intervention we recommend is peer-reviewed in some capacity, because we have lots of just random people popping up to serve victims of human trafficking. Okay, and then finally, on this last page, I have a set of resources. So the first is the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. As I said before, the DV-SA movement, the domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking movement, is really at the forefront of what it means to provide empowerment-based services to victims of crime. And I think we should be looking to them. And the Michigan Coalition includes human trafficking as a part of its definition. And they do really great trainings on this topic, et cetera. In terms of local organizations that provide what we think in the clinic are good comprehensive services to victims of human trafficking, the YWCA of Kalamazoo has a statewide program that's been incredible, and Turning Point in Macomb is starting one very similar to the Y shortly. These are both organizations that have been serving victims of crime for decades. and have a strong reputation. So the Human Trafficking Hotline, that's what it is. It's the place where you can go and report trafficking. It's also the place that has statistics. Humantrafficking.umich.edu, that's the Human Trafficking Collaborative. You can find information out about the clinic. There's also trainings for medical professionals on that site. And then finally, the Freedom Network website at the bottom, that is the sort of national network of anti-trafficking providers and experts that it's the only one I have faith in. So with that, there was a ton of information in a short amount of time, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Hey, we've lost our host, Rebecca. She lost her Wi-Fi. So Sarah, I'm going to ask if you can please give the questions to Elizabeth that appeared in the chat.
Sure, I can. That's too bad. So 4 questions here. First one was from Lori Lickman. And if psychological coercion is considered human trafficking, this has to do with the local county prosecutor's office. How does Eli Savitt discern someone is engaged in consensual sex work? And of course, we've heard that he's not charging consensual sex work. Could you speak to this issue?
Well, I mean, I think the challenge of identifying psychological coercion is true no matter what. And what I would say is that historically, whether we charge people with prostitution or not, we have done a poor job of identifying any kind of coercion. So I know that Prosecutor Savitt's policy is concerning to some people, right? There are different opinions about whether it is appropriate to essentially say, I'm not going to charge for consensual commercial sex. And what I would say is that we have been charging for consensual commercial sex for decades in this county, and we were not identifying victims of human trafficking. We were not effectively doing anything about human trafficking. And what the prosecutor is trying to do is approach this differently. He has made clear that he will prosecute for human trafficking when he can identify it. And I agree, it's hard to identify. But I don't think that it's any more or less hard whether you say that you will prosecute for consensual sex or not. In fact, I think for some people, reducing the fear that they will be criminalized for engaging in commercial sex consensually could make people more willing to open up about what's actually happening. I am in favor of anything that reduces the chances of my clients being criminalized. I have just worked with enough people who have been criminalized. And the idea that we are reducing that risk is something that I support.
Thank you. Very helpful. Tried to let someone in who for some reason is in the waiting room. Second question from Sandy Serini Elzer. What is residential sex trafficking?
People just running, I mean, the other word you might hear for it would be a brothel, right? Like that's a sort of common phrase, but the idea is that just like there can be a person who owns a home in your neighborhood who has 1, 2, 3, I don't know how many individuals in it that are regularly performing commercial sex acts out of homes, right? There's no marking, it's not a business, it's just a house, but there's commercial sex happening inside.
And third question, Vicky D asks, are the people begging at traffic intersections victims of sex trafficking? I know someone mentioned to me that she sees people out on the corner of Jackson and North Maple. Yeah,
there's a couple spots. So whether they're victims of human trafficking is a case-by-case assessment. And I have, in years past, I've heard from the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office that when they have tried to determine if any of those individuals are victims of human trafficking, generally their assessment has been that they are not, right? So there's no identified case of human trafficking on those intersections. That was pre-pandemic. I haven't talked to the county sheriff's office since that time. Those instances we've read about more in places like New York City. But again, it doesn't mean it isn't happening here. It's just that we haven't specifically identified that, yes, this is an issue where at this particular point in time, that practice in Washtenaw County is a site of trafficking.
I guess you would have to find the person who's overseeing them, and that can be
Right.
hard.
Theoretically, yeah. So what it's looked like in other situations is it's usually involved kids, but it's like, so in other parts of the country, there've been situations where like someone says, I'm selling a candy bar for a donation. And that donation can be anywhere from $1 to whatever you want. And so they start handing them $25, $35, $40, right? And in fact, that kid is taking that money back to some sort of third party who's pocketing the money. And that's what it's looked like in other scenarios.
Gosh, does that ever happen via door knocking? I think I've only seen legitimate.
Well, I will tell you that those traveling, the traveling magazine sales may not be human trafficking, but they are pretty gross labor practices all around. And they're just like a gray hairs way from getting into, you're splitting hairs before you'd be getting into trafficking. So yes, door-to-door sales by like DTE or Verizon is different, but those traveling magazine sales, not so
magazines, candy, but usually it's been around high school kids, so I don't think it's been an issue. And then one more question, unless we have some additional ones, but the next question I have here is Linda Seyfried Ward. If you saw the movie Freedom, I don't know if you saw that, how valid do you think the representation is of trafficking?
The Sound of Freedom, I think, is what's being referenced. I think it is an absolutely horrific depiction of what human trafficking is. I can't, there's not enough time for me to go on and on about why it's so bad, but it is incredibly inaccurate. This is going to sound like bragging, I don't mean it, but if you Googled Elizabeth Campbell, NPR, Sound of Freedom, I was featured recently on an NPR piece about the misinformation around human trafficking, specifically in the context of Sound of Freedom. I would be horrified if that was the education that people walked away with about human trafficking.
So I'm just looking now.
I see one. It says, once you determine someone is a victim of human trafficking, what happens to the victim and to the offender? And the answer to that is all over the map. Sometimes I identify them and they're still in their trafficking situation. So we are in crisis mode to see how we can get them out of trafficking. And that's where places like the YWCA of Kalamazoo and Turning Point Macomb come in to provide those basic immediate needs of housing, food, etc. A lot of my clients come to me after they've escaped their trafficking 5-10 years later, but their life is still in shambles because they were exploited at some particular point in time. So I'm really just focused on their legal needs, but they're currently in a safe position. Most offenders, there are no consequences to. The vast majority of my cases go unprosecuted. And so most offenders are living their lives. Again, that's not 100% true. There have been some prosecutions, but it's pretty rare.
Yeah, Joel Herman asks, as a CPS investigator looking at cases in Washtenaw County.
I see it.
You see it?
Yes. So the question is can the Department of Health and Human Services refer victims of human trafficking for services? If they're legal services, right? We don't provide, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a counselor, I don't have housing, I don't have food. They would really specifically need a set of legal services. And we do not, we can consult often, but like if the idea is, do they need a guardian ad litem or something like that, we can certainly talk to CPS about what role we could play in that. We have represented minors in sort of protective, proceedings in the past. It just depends on the circumstances, but that's the kind of thing that usually what happens is we will get a call either directly from the CPS worker or from the prosecutor's office on the case, who's pursuing the sort of protective proceedings.
And I'm not sure whether you addressed Lori Lichtman's question about using a model like they use in Maine.
Yeah. So that the equality model, the idea there is you do not charge the providers of commercial sex, right? The individual, but you do charge the purchasers, right? So if you think about there's a buyer and a seller, you can charge the buyers with all kinds of crimes, but you do not charge the sellers. And the idea is that probably if, the power dynamic in that relationship is that the buyer has a lot more power than the seller, right? So that was primarily championed, it's called the Nordic model, out of Nordic countries in Europe. And what I would say is the data on what is the most effective is pretty varied. You can find studies that show that the Nordic model is more effective at identifying trafficking and reducing vulnerability. There are also studies that show that that's not necessarily the case. I think the Nordic model makes an enormous amount of intuitive sense, right? Again, if you just want to sort of protect the vulnerable parties, you just eliminate any criminalization for them. And you only sort of attach criminal consequences to the sellers. It's complex, right? And how that would work in our current, system would take an enormous amount of time to sort of figure out efficacy. But again, what I know is that what we've been doing for the last however many decades of arresting folks for prostitution hasn't worked. So I am open to alternatives to that model, whether it be the Nordic model, whether it be decriminalizing consensual commercial sex, et cetera.
Okay, I think that's the last question, and we are right at the end of the time here. So I just want to thank you so much on Rebecca's half and the League's half for Washtenaw County for agreeing to present this information to us. We are all very much more knowledgeable now, I'm sure. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for spending your afternoon with me.